In this video, I wanted to talk to you about clause 6.1, which talks about risks and opportunities. And this is a very big topic when it comes to ISO certification. So I just wanted to make sure that I take my time and explain everything that you need to understand as regards this particular clause. And we're going to start off with clause 6.1.1. Okay, so clause 6.1 relates to the risks and opportunities, and it is further broken down into three subclauses: 611, 612, and 613. Okay, and we're going to discuss all of these right now in this presentation. Okay, so let's start a bit by bit. And as you can see, the standard is telling us that when planning for the information security management system, the organization shall consider the issues referred to in 4.1 and the requirements referred to in 4.2 and determine the risks and opportunities that need to be addressed. Okay? To, of course, make sure that we achieve the intended outcomes, prevent or reduce undesired effects, achieve continual improvement. Okay? So what is the standard actually saying? The standard is saying that this SWOT analysis that we would have done in clause 4.1 needs to have been updated to make sure that we're considering the needs of the interested parties. Okay, so if, for example, conformity to regulations, there is some element of it that needs to be considered within the SWOT analysis, for example, that, I don't know, that we do not have a strong internal process to review these conformity to regulations, so that can be included as a weakness, and ultimately we're going to end up with a finished and updated SWOT analysis or context analysis when it comes to our organization. Okay, so that is clause for information. But now, moving on to clause 6.1.1, the standard is telling us that we have to take this information and do some type of risk assessment on it. Okay, so we have to determine what the actions needed for these risks and opportunities, how we're going to integrate and implement these actions in the information security management system, and how we're going to evaluate the effectiveness of these actions. Okay, so let's focus on this first part right now. So yeah, in clause 4.1 we identified the external and internal factors. Now we have to rank the order in which these factors must be addressed within to prioritize what is most important for your information security management system. And to do that, I like to do an FMEA, which is called failure mode and effect analysis. And the RPN is the risk priority number that will guide us on which risks are most relevant to our organization, and therefore which ones we should attack the first when working on this information security management system. Now, to work out this FMEA, this RPN, risk priority number, we're going to define three metrics ultimately. Okay, so we're going to define the severity, the occurrence, and the detection. Okay, so, and before starting with that, I wanted to explain that, like, what level of detail are we going into? Larger companies might have multiple departments, they might have thousands of people working with them, so they might also want to have multiple risk assessments. Smaller organizations might want to have one risk assessment governing all their organization. So again, the risk assessment mentality has to be applied for the risk assessment itself. Okay? Typically, companies employing less than 100 to 200 people would just have one risk assessment covering all activities within their organization. Now, the severity, occurrence, and detection. Severity is if the issue were to occur, what kind of trouble would we be in? Okay? The occurrence relates to the probability that a particular issue will occur, and detection is how likely are we to notice that this problem is coming into fruition. Okay? So the FMEA is used to help us prioritize these risks. In information security worlds, there is the idea of impact and exposure. However, from experience, I think that the FMEA approach is more in line with what most clients would need. And as a side note, it's good for you to understand that the standard doesn't tell us exactly which framework we have to use. We just have to define something that is relevant for our needs. So here you have an explanation of what each and every one of these ratings mean. As you can see, the severity, the higher the severity, the higher the number will be. The more frequent it is, the higher the number will be. But for detection, it's the other way around. The less likely we are able to identify that that risk is coming to fruition, the higher the number would be. Okay? And ultimately, we'll get the RPN by multiplying the value for the severity, occurrence, and detection. So in this case, it's 10 times 5 times 6, which would result in an RPN of 300. And let's take an example not relevant to information security, but just for you to be able to depict how we're going to use this FMEA to help us prioritize risks. Okay, so here we have an example of the brakes within a car not working properly. Okay, so as you can understand, the severity over there is 10, it would be catastrophic. The occurrence, how likely is it for the brakes of a car to stop working randomly, sort of? And for this particular case, we gave it a rating of 5. Okay, now what is the likeliness of the driver noting that the brakes aren't working before actually pressing the brake pedal? Okay, so if you're driving and you suddenly press the brake and you notice that it's not working, pressing the brakes would have meant that you need to slow down your car. Now, if you find out at that time that your brakes aren't working, then you're going to have an issue. But what if we install some type of sensors, some type of device that would help us to, on the dashboard, have some type of notification that the brakes aren't working? That would invariably increase the level for us to be able to detect that issue. And let's say that this rating, instead of it being a 6, it would be, let's say, a 1. So we would have effectively reduced the risk from 300 to 10 times 5 times 1, which would make it 50. Okay? Another example is that the car won't start. Of course, the problem is bad because you might miss appointments, you might not be able to go wherever you wanted to go, but there is no physical harm, like the brakes not working. The occurrence, there are many things that could lead to a car not starting, yet it's not very common that cars just won't turn on. And detection, if you're not inside the car, and so even if you have an indication on the dashboard or whatever, you're not going to be able to see it. Just go in the car, try to turn it on, and it won't work. At that point, it is definitely too late. Okay? So within Miss Frog, when you are identifying any risk, so once again, the context analysis is taking, so currently, for example, in this case, currently not doing penetration testing on the servers for cabinet and website hosting. Okay, so that risk would automatically pop up here. Okay, and here we have the ability to define the severity, occurrence, and detection with the metrics table to explain the values for us. And we're going to have the mitigation actions. We're going to explain what we're going to do to reduce this particular risk. Okay, so for example, currently not doing penetration testing on the servers for cabinet, and we could say that a mitigation action could be to outsource penetration testing to a third-party company. Okay. Of course, by working in this type of software, we have the ability to assign a task to someone with a due date. But ultimately, what we're trying to do here is that we're trying to reduce the severity of this rating, okay? The severity of this risk. So here we have the risk before this mitigation action is implemented. Here we're going to once again prioritize the risk after implementing that action. So now if we're doing, let's say, an annual penetration testing, that is going to reduce, and like that we're going to see that the risk has reduced as well. Okay, of course the numbers that we have here are fictitious and they're just here to give you an example of how this works. The risk before the mitigation action is called the inherent risk. It is the risk level as it exists naturally without any attempts to reduce it. The residual risk is the remaining risk after mitigation measures have been put in place. Okay, so that is a bit of a further explanation of what we're talking about here when it comes to the risk assessment. Now, as you can understand, the standard goes further in clause 6.1. Specifically in clause 6.1.2, the standard talks about doing a risk assessment. Okay, so if we were to see the wording within the standard itself, then the standard is telling us that we have to establish and maintain information security risk criteria that include risk acceptance criteria and criteria for performing information security risk assessments. So risk acceptance criteria is another word to define the risk appetite. Okay, so here we're going to say that, for example, any risk above 100, and so the 100 would be the multiplication of these three values together, and this is arbitrary and you're going to choose it. But as an organization, we might say that any risk below 100 is not going to be accepted. Okay, like that we are defining the risk acceptance criteria, and the criteria for performing information security risk assessments, as I've explained, it is defined over here. We are using this criteria, this metrics table, to guide us, to make sure that we have a repeatable way that if we are doing a risk assessment today on a particular risk, we have criteria guiding us to be able to come up with a number of the risk for that particular risk. And if we were to do it next year, or if someone else were to do it, ideally we're going to get to the same value, to the same risk priority number. That is what the standard is saying over here. We're going to ensure that repeated information security risk assessments produce consistent, valid, and comparable results, which is only attainable through having criteria for performing information security risk assessments, and that the risk assessment identifies the information security risks. Okay, so we're going to use it to identify risks that could have an impact on the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So, and this would have to be repeated multiple times. Here it might be a good idea to go back to your context analysis and say, okay, so what are in terms of confidentiality, what are my strengths, my weaknesses, my opportunities, my threats, so in terms of integrity, in terms of availability, do we have downtime? Are we better in terms of our competitors when it comes to uptime? Integrity, maybe we've had some lost information or some information that was manipulated, that we did in a way that wasn't acceptable for the organization. So like this, we are defining the various risks, and this is an exercise that must keep on happening. we also have to identify the risk owners. Okay, so in terms of risk owners in the risk assessment, we're going to identify who is responsible to implement the mitigation actions for each risk, and invariably the risk owner must be the person who is going to mitigate the issue. Of course, the risk owner might want to delegate some of the mitigation work to third parties, to colleagues, to other suppliers, etc. Having said that, it is very important that the risk owner takes full ownership of the risk and that they are working towards reducing the potential negative impact of that particular risk. We're going to analyze the information security risk, assess the potential consequences that would result if the risks identified were to materialize. So that is another word for saying the severity, the occurrence and detection. Okay, so here we're seeing considerations that we have to give when we are prioritizing the risk, and determine the levels of risk, as I explained earlier, by multiplying the values for severity, occurrence, and detection. Then we're going to evaluate the information security risks by comparing the results of the risk analysis with the risk criteria established and prioritize the analyzed risks for risk treatment. So if we were to do it, of course, this can be done in an Excel sheet by prioritizing the risks, etc., and putting the inherent and residual risks, etc. But here we're doing it on this software for the scope of this explanation, so we're going to sort by the inherent risk. Okay, clearly this is the highest risk that we have right now, and given that our risk appetite is set to 100 and this risk has a residual risk of 135, then we still need to do more mitigation actions so that we can reduce this residual risk to below 100. Okay, effectively that's what we are saying. And invariably, once you start using this as an actual tool to control your business, you're going to have a very long list. Okay, so you might want to say, listen, I'm going to focus only on risks that are above, I don't know, 200, or risks that their inherent risk have a value of more than 100, maybe. The point is that you have to prioritize the analyzed risks to make sure that you are using your resources effectively. Okay? So, in a nutshell, as I explained, an information security risk assessment has to be done. We have to define the risks relating to our information security based on the internal and external issues, based on the interested parties, all with a focus in mind for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. We have to prioritize these risks, and we're going to do that using the RPN, risk priority number, by multiplying the severity, occurrence, and detection. Okay, and we have to do that. We have to calculate the risk priority number before and after the mitigation actions to calculate the inherent and residual risk. Okay, so to implement it, once again, we're doing the FMEA, failure mode and defect analysis. There are various tools that you can use online. Having said that, I suggest that you keep this as simple as possible and do not go overboard over what I have explained in this particular training session. And once again, keep in mind that you're creating something that is relevant for your own exacting needs. Okay? And we've already went through this. Now, there is another element that I wanted to discuss on this particular clause, which is clause 613. Okay, and clause 613 is effectively talking about the information security risk treatment now. Okay, so before we were doing a risk assessment, we were prioritizing the risks, and now we're considering the treatment element. Now, this is a very interesting conversation, because how technically this should work is that, and let me show you the screens on Miss Frog to be able to explain myself better. So, as you can understand, in the context analysis, we have defined some weaknesses, okay, and threats. And for example, let's take weak HR processes could result in hiring people with bad intentions and focus on that part for the sake of this example. Okay? So now we have a risk. So that came from 4.1, clause 4.1. Now in clause 6.1, we are considering the risk assessment, which is coming from clause 4.1. So we're seeing it here. And let's say that we have weak HR processes, which could result in hiring people with bad intentions. The severity of that could be devastatingly high, but the likelihood of occurrence, if we were to see it, I would say it would be a 3. You know, it's low, relatively low amount of failures. Most people have good intentions to begin with. As you can see, there is no exact scientific way in which I'm going to determine between a 3 and a 4, but ultimately I'm not getting confused between a 3 and a 7. The range of tolerance here is relatively narrow. Are we going to notice, by not doing anything, are we going to notice if we've hired a person with bad intentions, let's say 8, and 8 meaning that there are remote chances of detection, meaning that maybe during the interview process we would be able to pick this up from anything that would have been mentioned, but it is very hard to do so. Having said that, now we are arriving to the part where we are determining the mitigation actions, okay? And here the standard is telling us that we should select appropriate information security risk treatment options, so ways, mitigation actions that we're going to deploy to reduce that particular risk, okay? Determine all controls that are necessary to implement the information security risk treatment options chosen, okay? So organizations can design controls as requires or identify them from any source, which means that you can do whatever you think is best for your organization. But then you would need to compare these controls, these actions, with whatever is being mentioned in Annex A and verify that no necessary controls have been omitted. Okay? So let's go back to this example. Weak HR processes could result in hiring people with bad intentions. And if we were to go in Annex A, in the section of people, which would have the controls that are most relevant to this particular risk, we're seeing that, for example, screening. So there is a risk here that we might recruit someone who has bad intentions. In this case, we're getting a police conduct and doing a background check. Okay? So here the standard is asking us to link the risks that we have for the organization to Annex A controls. This is a requirement of this particular clause, and it can be accomplished in different ways, as you can understand. But ultimately, what we have to do is that for each risk, for example here, we might either define some actions that we're going to do to mitigate these risks, or else we can say that, for example, this is tackled through Annex A 6.1. Okay, what is Annex A 6.1? Annex A 6.1 is this one, okay? A 6.1, which is screening. Okay, it can also be covered through terms and conditions of employment, or it can be covered, for example, through a disciplinary process, with the fact that if someone might do something within the organization. So this is 6.1, okay, and this is 6.4. So if someone does anything to our information security posture that goes against any law, there might be a disciplinary process which might also be linked with the terms and conditions of employment or with the employment contract. That would mean that that person would be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Okay, so or we might include something within the confidentiality and non-disclosure agreement. So when doing the risk assessment, and thinking about the treatment plan, we can either write explicit mitigation actions over here, or else we can define NXA controls that are specifically going to be used to mitigate this specific risk. Okay, so there are different ways in which this can be met. Now, and again, I will go into a lot of more detail about NXA controls in another video, but for now I wanted to explain how the risk assessment methodology works as regards ISO 27001. And here I have to go back to NXA controls, meaning, so the standard is telling us that first of all, the controls listed in NXA are not exhaustive, even though, trust me, they are very detailed and they talk about everything, but we can include other additional information, security controls, as we need. And in sections D of 613, the standard tells us to produce a statement of applicability that contains the necessary controls. Okay, so which controls are we going to implement? And any justifications for their inclusion, whether the necessary controls are implemented or not, the justification for excluding any of the NXA controls. So let's take it step by step. What is a statement of applicability? A statement of applicability is ultimately a document that we can generate. Let me see if we're able to do this. Yes. Okay. Because of course the software has some elements of validation to make sure that you've actually considered all of your controls before downloading the statement of applicability. Now, let me just open it. So in this case, what is the standard telling us? Let us go through these two requirements. So the necessary controls, this is a statement of applicability, which is also known as SOA, statement of applicability. Okay, we have a list of controls that are being considered. Okay, if justification for inclusion is inherent, because if there's a risk relating to that particular, so if we go, for example, to the same example that we were seeing, might recruit someone who has bad intentions. That is the justification of this particular control making sense for our organization. We're going to define whether the necessary controls are implemented or not, and if we're not going to include any one of them, for example, in this case, here we're seeing access to source code. If the company doesn't do any development, then access to source code is not relevant. So in this case, we're going to say that it is not applicable and the company is not involved in doing any development work. Okay? So like that, we are considering all of these things. We're going to formulate an information security risk treatment plan. Well, that is done by considering that within each element of the statement of applicability, as you can remember, we have defined, not in this example, but in general, we could have defined who is going to be responsible to implement which tasks. For example, for that one, a police conduct is acquired for each employee. And here we can say that, this task is going to be assigned to Samuel Barrett for the sake of the example, and we can define a due date. And like that, we would have effectively created a risk treatment plan. And we need to obtain risk owners' approval of the information security risk treatment plan and acceptance of the residual information security risks. Okay, so to do this, rather than having this documented and a procedure that governs this whole activity, I would rather that the conversation about defining what the risks are, what the mitigation actions will be for that specific risk, the inherent and the residual risk for each risk. I'd rather that this would be a conversation that involves all the stakeholders involved, and this takes me back to the implementation team that we've discussed earlier. People who are risk owners should invariably be involved in this implementation process. Okay, so let's not all create bureaucratic systems, but let's work together to create systems that work for your organization, and you can do this with the teams that you have. Okay, so that is all I had to say in terms of the requirements of the standard. So as a summary for the risk treatment plan, in 612, in clause 612, we have prioritized the risks, and now we're going to come up with a treatment plan. The treatment plan relates to actions that we're going to take to mitigate certain risks. The actions that we can use are defined in Annex A controls, but there are other mitigation actions that we can use. For all 93 controls defined in Annex A, we have to create a statement of applicability that has to define which controls are relevant to our organization and why, which controls that apply to our organization do not apply, and why they don't apply to our organization. So there has to be a justification. And for each mitigation action that we're coming up with in this statement of applicability, we have to have some type of treatment plan, some type of action plan to make sure that this action isn't something that we wrote on a software, on an Excel sheet, and that it's going to stay there forever, but our intention is that we actually implement things and take positive action towards improving your information security management system. And the risk treatment plan shall be planned, obtaining the risk owner's approval and acceptance of the residual information security risks, ideally by having a meeting with the relevant people so that a healthy discussion can be held. And mind you, I've seen plenty, hundreds I would say, of these healthy discussions happening in organizations whereby you'd have people from different departments talking about the same issue, and you'd see that the different people from these different departments are seeing the same problem from a different perspective. And by combining these different perspectives into the same idea and using the different perspectives to come up with a risk assessment and risk treatment plan that is coherent for the different departments within the organization, for the different methods of thinking, and for the different levels within the organization, because top management, middle management, or operatives might see the same risk in a different way. So by having this collaborative approach, you're going to make sure that first of all, you're meeting the requirement of the standard, which says that we have to have risk owners' approval and acceptance of the residual information security risks. But secondly, you're going to create and foster a culture whereby the opinions of everyone are heard and decisions are taken as a team rather than as a dictatorship. So yes, we have to produce this statement of applicability, and it's going to include the points that I've mentioned earlier. And yes, that is all I had to say for this risk assessment requirements for clause 6.1. I hope that you found this useful, and I hope that you see the benefit of actually having a risk management system that is linked to tasks that people are doing to mitigate those risks. Because there are 1,000,001 things that we have to consider in an organization, and that business managers and leaders worry about, and that they have sleepless nights about them. But what if we can structure that information into one system, and that system would help us prioritize what these risks are, and we can take positive action towards mitigating these actions. And I'm saying all of this in the context of let's use ISO standards to help us improve our business. They are actual good fundamental tools to help us improve. They're not a document that we have to follow. Keyword is have to. I think what I'm trying to say is that we would want to follow these requirements because they make business and logical sense. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, feel free to get in touch. I'm always very happy to help you succeed on this journey. Thank you so much.